DTFF.
Again, here's Drinking and Talking Fantasy Football with your host, Jake Trowbridge and Dustin Lunt.
Welcome to all of you joining us on a very special episode at a very special time for Drinking and Talking Fantasy Football. Trowbridge taking over the main hosting duties for my compatriot, Dustin Lunt, who happens to be a little further up north than usual. Dustin, how you doing?
Well, I think it's more directly east from where we normally are. But yes, on the west coast of Michigan, and I am doing great, as we were talking about before the show started. Been sitting on the beach all afternoon long, drinking some Gentleman Jack. So I am ready to go. I am nice and lubed up, and I'm excited to talk about the AFC South this evening. It's going to be fun.
Yes. Gentleman Jack for a true gentleman. You also did expose my Achilles heel of not knowing geography. So you do get taken down a peg for your gentleman rankings because of that. But that's okay, because we have a real and true gentleman joining us as a representative from the Jacksonville Jaguars for this AFC South episode. Shane Barrett, Polly's playoff creator, contributor for Roto Heat. Welcome into you, sir. How are you doing?
Thank you very much for having me. Dustin, thank you for gracing us on your vacation. I am very happy to be here, gentlemen, and looking forward to drinking and talking fantasy football.
Well, luckily, we can deliver on at least 1.5 of those things, I'm pretty sure. Before we get into it, though, I do want you to talk. I mentioned it, but I want you to talk a little bit more about Polly's playoff, what that is, how folks might be able to participate or contribute in some way to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you for this opportunity too. So Polly's Playoff is a tournament to end Alzheimer's. So my wife's grandmother passed away from Alzheimer's in 2019. And shortly after that, in 2020, I created Polly's Playoff after being lucky enough to be in Scott Fish's division in my very first Scott Fish Bowl. It was wild. But he talked about in that tournament, like, if you've got a platform, do something good with it. And so I was like, you know what? We need something to help us raise money for the Alzheimer's Association and our walk to end Alzheimer's. So I started a fantasy tournament. It is a Superflex tiered PPR by distance tournament. There is no tight end premium. There is trading, and it's a ton of fun. We've had a different winner every year. And I actually this year created a podcast called Polly's Playoff Features. And that is going through different people in the fantasy community who are playing in Polly's Playoff and have experienced Alzheimer's in some way. And so the 5th episode of that actually just dropped with the inaugural champion of Polly's Playoff, Leo Grandio, I think is how you say his last name. And so, yeah, just been trying to kind of create a community of people that play fantasy football and have experienced Alzheimer's, because it's also one of those diseases that not a lot of people talk about. So that's the spiel of what it is. How you can sign up, go to pollysplayoff.com, scroll to the bottom of the page and fill out the form. If you sign up, there's like a 99% chance that you're in. Some prizes we have: entry into Scott Fish Bowl 15, a Football Guys subscription, and a Javonte Williams signed football for the winner. Now,
phenomenal.
Because Jake and Dustin said I could, I'm also going to announce that starting tomorrow, there will be a giveaway for a DeAndre Swift gray Detroit Lions, if I can find which way it is, signed jersey. And I think all I'm going to do for you to be entered is sign up for Polly's Playoff and send me a screenshot of your donation. If you are already signed up, get a friend to sign up and send me their screenshot of them signing up or donating, and you're in for the prize. And I will announce that. I'll announce that next Wednesday, because I'm having my wife is having our 4th child next Friday. So I'll announce it
Hey.
before then.
Congratulations.
My goodness, Barry in the lead there. But no, that is incredible. Obviously, incredibly admirable what you're doing with Polly's Playoff. Everybody go sign up. We'll definitely be clipping this part of the pod out to flash over on
Absolutely.
socials and get
Appreciate
folks
that.
signed up. Albert, you yourself in the chat. Hello to you, first of all, Albert. Thank you for joining us again. Go sign up for Polly's Playoff. I also love that you have the DeAndre Swift jersey. We talked about DeAndre Swift a whole lot. Not on the NFC North episode because he's no longer in, but spoiler. Actually, we did talk about him on the NFC North.
He's
We
still
did.
in the NFC North.
But he's a
He made
Bear.
his way back.
God damn, he just can't stay away. In any case, I love that. And I encourage everybody to participate, just like I encourage folks, not necessarily you have to participate, but if you are, I would love for you to drop us in the chat what you're drinking as we talk about what we're drinking. Tonight, I am reindulging, Dustin. This is one that you had brought over a few weeks back. I only had the one. I'm going back for round two. This is Youngblood Beer Company. It's Sir. This is a Wendy's. It's a delightful fruit punch sour. And I'm very
So
psyched
good.
about it. Yeah, it's very good. Dustin, you told us you're drinking some Gentleman Jack. Are you mixing anything with the Gentleman Jack?
You don't mix Gentleman Jack. That is a whiskey that you just maybe an ice cube or two just to cut it slightly, but otherwise it's just neat. This is not one that you add a mixer to.
You're one of those guys, huh? You're going to be snobby
I am.
on me
I'm
all of a
snobby.
sudden?
I am.
Completely agree with him.
What? Fine. You two damn snobs I'm surrounded by on this podcast. Shane, what are you drinking?
I only agree with him on Gentleman Jack. Like those nicer whiskeys, you can't bourbons, whatever the hell you want to call it. You can't muck those up with Coke or anything unless you're making like a mixed like old fashioned Manhattan, something like that. But I am drinking the Long Game. It is a tropical lager by Highland Brewing, and
that sounds fine. That sounds truly delightful. I don't think I've ever had anything by them before. Is Highland Brewing local to your area?
Relatively. I think if I remember correctly, it's in North Carolina. Gotcha. So it's really good. If you like, it's funny, they call it a tropical lager, but it's much closer to a tropical IPA. In my opinion, it's a little more bitter than your typical lager, but it's still really freaking good.
I'd never had a tropical lager before, so that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's really good. And one of my other favorite beers, and from my guilty pleasure TV show, Southern Charmed, is a tropical IPA. So I really like this beer.
I'm big on tropical flavored anything, I found.
Amen.
Ever since tropical Skittles, they got me hooked early on. I don't know what to tell you. All right, we're not really in a tropical area for this division, but let me see if I can make this work here. Let me throw it to you, actually. Would you like to come out of the gate swinging on behalf of your Jacksonville Jaguars, Shane, or would you like to savor that? Save that towards the end.
I'd like to savor that, I think.
All right, it's beautiful. We'll wrap up nice and neat with the Jags then. Let's get through some of this other bullshit then on our way to the Jags. Let's start with the Tennessee Titans. I think that's a nice place to open up with.
Speaking of bullshit.
Yeah, that's the bullshit we're going to dive into first. We'll go through, as we do every episode, talking about what they've lost and what they've gained over the offseason here. Some losses are not really losses. Not all of these are notable, but you know the drill. Some notable losses, Derrick Henry. I think we can concede he is, in fact, notable. Ryan Tannehill, Chris Moore, Trevon Wesco. Some additions this offseason, Calvin Ridley, Tony Pollard, Tyler Boyd, and Mason Rudolph. In round 6, the only fantasy-relevant skill position player, Jaquan Jackson, wide receiver drafted in round 6 there. Let's start with the elephant that's no longer in the room or in the backfield. Let's start with Derrick Henry. How does the backfield shake out now that he's gone? So, Shane, are you very interested in this backfield? If you are you going more in favor of Pollard or Tyjae Spears, the incumbent dude?
You would start with this question of all questions.
That's what I do.
I am not interested in this backfield because I've never been a huge Tony Pollard fan. I see him fitting in better as we saw him in Dallas when Zeke was there and Zeke was more in his prime, as that kind of change of pace back where he's not having to shoulder the full load. And I'm worried that in Tennessee, even though Spears will, I think, still be a thorn in his side from a fantasy perspective, I still think Pollard's going to get a bulk of the workload, but I don't know if he's going to be as efficient as he was a la last year when he did have more of the workload in Dallas. And then Spears, I really like Spears, and he even had a 50% snap share last year with Derrick Henry in town. So I think the Titans believe in that talent. So I didn't understand Pollard being signed because I feel like their skill sets are similar enough to where it's not really a change, which I guess in theory could be a good thing because you don't have to change the offense based on who's playing running back. But I'm not really interested in either of them just because I think they're both going to eat into each other's production.
Yeah, man. I get that. The Venn diagram of those two feels like an overlapping circle to me.
Yeah.
Of like
Yeah.
what their skill sets are. So I'm fully on with you here. Dustin, if you had to take a stab at one of these guys, maybe you won't take a stab at either, but would you also be falling more in favor of Pollard? Do you have any preference at all here?
I'm going to take the guy that's being drafted later. So at this point, it's Spears. I don't believe in this backfield. It's going to be very muddled. As Shane said, it's very overlapping their skill sets. And I don't know if this is just maybe a little bit of a revamp of their offense. We saw them revamp their wide receiver core, and maybe they're going to utilize the running backs out of the backfield a little bit more now that Henry's gone, since that really wasn't what he was known for. So I just wonder if that's what they're looking at. But if I'm going to draft one of these guys, it's going to be Spears just because his ADP is a heck of a lot cheaper than what Pollard's going for right now.
Yeah, I think it's going to be that answer of just like, once again, whoever's cheapest, which is just my lamest answer that I ever give. And yet I give it a lot. And I'm going to do it here as well. These two, I love what you called out, Shane, about them. Again, it's like, it doesn't really matter which of them is on the field for the offense, because I feel like that's a trend that's been happening a lot in this offseason in particular, which brings me back actually to a trade that I forgot to call out earlier on in the episode, but we're going to use this as a transition here because I feel like the Rams did a very similar situation with their backfield. So to tie it in, it's not quite a drunk trade, or at least we don't know if it's a drunk trade. It might have been. But let's take the opportunity to talk about a backfield that's very similar here, and let's see if we can piece this together with Titans and the Tennessee Titans. So you saw Blake Corum and Brock Bowers get traded for Kyren Williams.
Correct.
Out in the world.
Correct.
So speaking of those two running backs,
Clones.
I would say Kyren Williams. Clones. Absolutely clones. So Kyren Williams is the guy. And I think Dustin and I have mentioned that maybe, Blake Corum is just a real legitimate insurance policy, break glass in case of emergency. Is that how you view that backfield as well?
That's personally how I view it. I feel like the foot injury that Kyren Williams recently had reported was way overblown because I've seen videos of him going through training camp and looking absolutely fine. I will admit I'm also a bit of a Notre Dame fan, so I love Kyren Williams. I've loved Kyren Williams for a very long time. So when he went off last year, I was very happy and very proud. But I think this is a break, like you said, break glass in case of emergency type of thing, because Sean McVay doesn't really go to a committee. He always has that one back that he really just rides. And I think it's going to be Kyren Williams. Corum feels like an injury insurance policy, exactly like you said. So that's why part of the reason I submitted this as the drunk trade of the week, if you will, is because a lot of the response that I saw on Twitter when I first saw it was like, oh, it's the Bowers Corum side by a country mile. And I'm like, I disagree with that. pretty significantly, because I just think Corum's role is going to be limited, and Kyron Williams was what, RB3 while he was healthy. So I don't know. I think the Bowers and Corum sign probably does win, but I'm way more like, I'm comfortable getting Kyron or for that.
I think this trade is a good indicator of where you stand philosophically in Dynasty. Like, it's more to me about like, how do you operate from a positional value within Dynasty? Dustin, do you also favor the Bowers side? Is it close? Is it not close for you with that trade?
I want to take the cop-out answer, and I think it really depends on where you're at as far as your team. Like, if I was a competing team, I would want Kyron Williams.
Yeah.
Because I don't think Brock Bowers is going to do much this year. It might be a couple years. I just don't trust that Las Vegas offense right now. So if I'm competing, give me Kyron, because I think he's a guy that can help you win a league. He's a guy that can push your team over the edge. But if I'm in a kind of a rebuilding mode, give me Brock Bowers. Hopefully he breaks out in a couple years, and then maybe Blake Corum can be a thing again in a couple years where, if Kyron doesn't work out, or if he does get hurt, you could always trade him then for additional draft capital at that point.
In a couple of years, Blake Corum is going to be 45 years old. I don't know if you know that. He's a very, very old rookie. Incredibly so, in fact. But I will say I lean the Brock Bowers side, but I do feel like people are overhyping, again, as we always do, rookie tight ends who, of course, he's going to come out and smash.
I mean, Brock Bowers, like, I saw a tweet the other day where it was like comparing him and Kyle Pitts, and Brock Bowers' statistics in college smoked Kyle Pitts. Smoked him. So, like, if you want to say generational talent on somebody, I'm cool with you saying that for Brock Bowers.
Fair. Well, then I'm going to use that liberally, probably throughout the rest of this podcast. But it sounds like we're all in agreement that, okay, the Brock Bowers side, sure, we'll take that side, but it's not as much of a slam dunk as probably a lot of the social media heads have made that out to be. I think Kyron Williams, the disrespect has gone too far. So I'm glad we got to come back to that. Now, to translate back to Tennessee, both those guys about the same age. I think Pollard's got an extra 2 years, maybe, on Tony Pollard.
25.
For Tony Pollard. On Tajay.
26, actually.
So that's not even a huge indicator. So I am also stumped on the backfield. I'm just going to be avoiding Tennessee. I will be leaning into Kyron Williams in LA. I will just be avoiding Tennessee, I think, entirely. So that takes us over to the quarterback. Will Levis, I will admit, I haven't thought much about Will Levis really until like the last 2 weeks. And I was like, oh man, they have so many guys there now. We mentioned the offseason additions. We've got Tyler Boyd there now, who I think is a very underrated wide receiver for actual NFL purposes. DeAndre Hopkins, I didn't really see him fall off last year. And now Calvin Ridley. I'm not a big Calvin Ridley fan by any means, but I think he helps any quarterback. So, Shane, when we're looking at Will Levis himself, is he a good late round target for a quarterback in a 1 QB league?
Absolutely. Even though we think the backfield is murky, they're two great weapons. The wide receivers you just lined up are great. They're old, so if you're playing Dynasty, but they're great, in my opinion. And then I know we'll talk about him in just a minute, but Chig has shown flashes of being really good. So I definitely think that that Levis is a good option, and I think with the regime change, we might see a little bit more of Will Levis than we're expecting. So he could totally flop on his face and have 4 interception games, but we'll see.
But anybody could do that, hypothetically. Amen. Actually, not
Absolutely.
anybody, but a lot of people could. But the upside, I do think, is tremendous there for Will Levis, where it's not for a lot of those guys. Dustin, you and I were talking pretty recently about this sort of like wealth of all the same type of quarterback that was available the further you got in the drafts. And it's like, all right, do I take Brock Purdy or do I wait a little bit and take Kirk Cousins and hope that he's healthy? Or do I wait a little bit further and take Matt Stafford and hope that he's healthy? That type of game. Would you forego those guys in favor of Will Levis even a little bit later on? Because I'm starting to think that Will Levis might be the better option out of all of those dudes. So I don't know. I think I'd be going Will Levis over, I don't know, taking Brock Purdy in the mid rounds at this point. Dustin, would you go Brock Purdy if he's still around QB 8, or would you wait and take Levis?
I would probably take Purdy over Levis. If we're talking strictly redraft, I like what they're doing, and I think this is going to be a make or break year for Levis. I think they gave him a bunch of weapons to see what they really have for him. So I mean, if there's a year where he's going to take a leap, this is going to be the year. So I would be comfortable taking him as, like a backup quarterback in a 1 QB league. Like if I was going to draft a second quarterback like really late, I would be fine taking him because I think there's really great upside, but there's also not a really great floor where he's going to give you some real stinker weeks. Like you said, he could have a 4 interception game and totally tank you. So, but I think the upside is tremendous. I mean, he could end up giving you winning weeks this year, just with the cast they've kind of built up around him.
Yeah. If it gets desperate out there, and let's say that you do wait and take Matt Stafford as your first quarterback, maybe go ahead and back him up with Will Levis.
Yeah, I like that.
See what happens in the first couple of games.
Another scenario that popped in my head is like if you take like an Anthony Richardson or a Jaden Daniels, who because of their rushing upside and injury history may maybe take Levis as a second QB in that situation as well.
I like that a lot, especially with Jaden Daniels, who runs like he's trying to puncture a lung every time. I swear to God, it's ridiculous. So you mentioned Chigokonkwo. Let's talk about him. Tight end, it's a good year, but it's still a weird year for tight end, like it is, I think, every year. But your assumptions about what his role actually looks like in Tennessee this year, is it enough to warrant fantasy viability for now?
That's a great question. I think it is, because I did a little bit of research, because I mentioned that regime change in Tennessee. And I was like, who is their offensive coordinator? And the answer to that question, Jake, is Nick Foles. And Nick Foles, before he was in Tennessee, was in Oakland/Las Vegas, where who was a large part of their offense? Darren Waller. So then he went to Jacksonville last year as their passing game coordinator, and we saw what Evan Ingram was able to do with, I guess, a similarly talented wide receiver core. I mean, hell, they had Calvin Ridley, so it's pretty freaking identical if you ask me. And Evan Ingram was still the number one target. So I think Chig has a chance to actually finally break out.
I like that. I mean, I'm always hopeful.
Me too.
I'm not going to put my stink on him as a tight end because I know if I start talking him up, he is going to face plant for sure. But I will say I'm tepidly on board with the idea of him. Lastly, I think before we move on from the Titans, just real quick here, if we're picking out a wide receiver from this group at ADP, let's try to factor in the values. I know ADPs aren't set yet, but we've got DeAndre Hopkins. We've got Calvin Ridley. We've got Tyler Boyd. Do any of them, let's not say do any, which would you choose based on their supposed ADP, which I'm sure it's going to go Ridley, and then a little bit later Hopkins, and then much later Boyd is my assumption there. Dustin, which of those three would you have based on that?
I would take Hopkins. Calvin Ridley's been too boomer bust. And I think Hopkins has a safer floor, and that's more how I tend to play. So yeah, give me Hopkins.
Yeah, lots of spikiness for Calvin Ridley. Shane, who would you be going with?
Well, I was looking at a Scott Fishbowl mock that I'm in currently and trying to see where they all went, but I can't find. There he is. So Calvin Ridley went on that one at the 8-11, and Hopkins went at the 10-12. At that price, I'm taking Hopkins. And either way, I think I'm taking Hopkins just because we've seen Levis trust him. I mean, hell, I think he had a 4-touchdown game and 3 of them went to Hopkins. Like, give me that.
Give me that. I like it because Calvin Ridley, I do think, will be the guy running down the field, relying on the big plays, which is going to be really hard to bank on with Will Levis unless he takes a step forward. Hopkins probably moves a little bit closer, right? Gets a little bit more of the, not slot work. Tyler Boyd will do that. By the way, Hoove is all about that Tyler Boyd action here.
Interesting.
Not to say that I hate it, but I would also be going with DeAndre Hopkins based on that value. All right, let's move on from Tennessee. Let's move to Houston. I want to talk Houston. They haven't done a ton this offseason, but they did lose Devin Singletary, and they did gain Joe Mixon and Stephon Diggs. In the draft in round 4, they added Cade Stover at tight end. In round 6, Jahar Jordan at running back. So, talking about wide receivers, let's keep it going for this group. A much more interesting group, I would say, for fantasy. We now have Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stephon Diggs. If we are drafting today, which of these wide receivers would you want for redraft? And let me tack on, which one are you most excited about for Dynasty as well? Shane, so redraft, Dynasty, who do you want out of this crew?
Oh, you added a Dynasty mix to it. That might, I don't know if that changes my answer though. I really like Nico from what I was looking at earlier. His target share was fairly consistent. He only, other than week 14 and week 3 last year, he had at least 4 targets. And I know that's not a super high floor, but I feel like with the progressing of CJ Stroud and this offense as a whole, he may be able to be a little bit more efficient even with just 4 targets, but it felt like he had a really decent floor from a target perspective, and he just got paid. He's going to want to try and prove that he's worth the contract, I think. I'm taking Nico, but you would not have to twist my arm to take Tank in either redraft or Dynasty. I'm not really interested in Stephon Diggs, to be completely honest with you. And I think him being slowing down in Buffalo towards the end of last season was tremendously overblown because of their offensive switch and being more running focused. But I think he will be valuable from a real football standpoint, but not necessarily a football or a fantasy football standpoint.
I love everything that you just said there. What are your thoughts here, redraft versus Dynasty? Any difference in these guys for you?
I would probably take Stephon Diggs for redraft for just this year, but for Dynasty, I'm all about Nico Collins. I love him. I love that they're committed to him, but Stephon Diggs is only in town guaranteed for this year. So I feel like he has something to prove this year, that he's still got something left in the tank. He's going to go out and have a good year this year and then probably move on, try to get one last paycheck somewhere else. So for, like I said, this year, redraft, give me Stephon Diggs, but long term, give me Nico Collins.
I like it. Whew. I'm also out on Stephon Diggs for this year. I don't like it. You mentioned last year he slowed down, but it was also the year before where he hit the skids like halfway through the season. He's just weird in inability to remain consistent. I don't know what it is with him. Maybe the change of scenery will fix that, like Dustin said. I would say, if I'm going to project these guys, I'd say Nico finishes with the most fantasy points throughout the year, but Tank's probably going to be the best value because I think he'll be going a couple rounds later in redraft. So that would be my preference, is just to wait. And long-term, I'm a big Nico Collins guy just because I have a lot of shares of him and I need to believe in him. I don't have any shares of Joe Mixon, and I know Dustin does not have any shares either. Shane, are you investing in Joe Mixon for this year? I guess. And what do you compare his role to that he had in Cincinnati to what he's going to have this year in Houston?
Jake, I replied to your tweet tagging me announcing the episode earlier this evening with a hell yeah. For Joe Mixon, the answer is hell no.
You had me scared for a second.
No.
I know.
I have been out on Joe Mixon for probably 3 or 4 years. He's just inconsistent, and then he has that one game where he scores 50 points and it blows up the rest of his season. So he looks like he's a viable option when really he's not. And then on top of that, while he's probably more talented than Devin Singletary, but I don't think by much at this point in his career. Singletary had about 40 carries less and 30 targets fewer, to where, and that was without Stephon Diggs in the mix. I think it will be a similar role to what we saw with Singletary last year, which is about 215 carries and about 30 or 40 targets. And maybe the targets on that goes up just because maybe Mixon's a little bit better of a receiver, but I think that's probably going to be where he ends up finishing just because there's way too many mouths to feed. And to me, I would be going to tank Nico and Diggs and Schultz before I would go to Mixon because I'm not a Mixon fan.
We're all staunchly against Joe Mixon here on tonight's podcast.
Yep.
But yeah,
Sorry,
I think
Joe.
you nailed it. I don't think that he actually improves that backfield from a real NFL standpoint that much outside of being a slightly better pass catcher.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's like 4th or 5th on this offense for catching passes. So Dustin, I don't need to ask you where your stance is on Joe. We know about that. But let's talk about Dalton Schultz now getting 2 more target, maybe leaders into the mix with possibly Joe Mixon being ahead of him and very likely Stephon Diggs being ahead of him in the pecking order. So at this stage in the game, and I think I've seen as of right now, he's still somewhere between, I don't know what, tight end 11 to tight end 14, somewhere in that mix, I think, for ADP. Do we consider that to be overvalued or undervalued given the landscape? Dustin, do you think that's a value to get Schultz around that range?
I do, especially if you're punting tight end. I feel like he's going to have a pretty safe floor. We saw what he's done previously with them and last year. Another guy that they paid, they wanted to keep around. So they obviously believe in him. They have a plan for him to be a part of this offense. So yeah, I think he is a good value where he's going at. Like I said, especially if you're punting the position, if he's, say tight end, on the low end, 14, he'll finish within the top 10, I feel like, pretty easily. And I know that's not a high bar for tight ends to finish, but if you're not attacking that position early to get someone that's going to finish inside the top 10 and you're not paying that price, yeah, I'm all over that all day long.
Interesting. Shane, what are your thoughts on Schultz for this season?
Yeah, I love Schultz for this season. One sneaky little nugget that I want to point out is since 2020, when he really kind of took over in Dallas and even his one season in Houston, he's had at least 4 touchdowns. And that for tight ends is huge because if they're catching touchdowns, if they're that red zone threat, it boosts their value pretty significantly. And just like Dustin said, if you're punting tight end, I absolutely love Dalton Schultz. Like I've been doing Scott Fishbowl mocks like crazy, and tight end for some reason is the position that I've been punting, despite the scoring boost that I think they're going to get. But I'm loving getting Dalton Schultz where I'm getting him.
That's so interesting. I'm the only one of us out on Dalton Schultz here, which tracks because, again, I have trash tight end takes. So I'll just enjoy watching him go off as tight end 2 by the time the season wraps.
You've never been a big fan of his anyway, Jake. So
yeah,
it's about par for the course.
I've always felt like a guy has to be a real elite talent, like a George Kittle level talent, to be able to break out from all of that target competition. And I just don't see that with Dalton Schultz. He's in a similar predicament to like Cole Kmet in my eyes, or even maybe Dallas Goedert, to a lesser extent. Like, I think that's all in the same milieu. So don't take my word for it here. I'm an avid tight end train wreck, I think. So let's talk. Look, all these guys are going to get the targets, and if they're all going to be good to some extent for fantasy football, that means CJ Stroud throwing, like a beast like last year, 780 pass attempts. But honestly, I just want to ask this with Stroud. We know he's good. We know he'll be good for fantasy. But, Dustin, we've talked about this before, but I'm curious, Shane, out of these three quarterbacks, who I all think are kind of the same guy, who would you prefer? So we've got CJ Stroud, we've got Jordan Love, we've got Brock Purdy. That seems like a grouping to me that could finish very close. Do you have a preference out of them?
CJ Stroud by a country mile.
Ooh, hachi chachi. Especially just the more pass attempts, the better crew, all that sort of thing.
And Bobby Slowick is still there, if I remember correctly, and it seems like he's got CJ right where he wants him. They added talent in the offseason. I jokingly, in the leagues that I have CJ in Dynasty, changed his nickname on Sleeper to CJ6K because I I think he's going to do really well this year.
It's a phenomenal nickname, and now I do hope that he throws for 6,000 yards this year.
Make me a profit.
Glad to know. Dustin, have you changed your stance out of that crew at all? Who are you sticking with out of those three?
Yeah, I'm going to stick with Stroud as well. Personally, I don't like to draft quarterbacks that early, but if you're going just on the talent alone, yeah, give me Stroud. He's just a superior talent to the other two quarterbacks. And I'm not, besmirching my Jordan Love here, but he is a superior talent, and that he has higher end wide receivers, I feel like, on his team as well. So that's why I would lean towards him.
I like it. Well, let's keep talking about some very exciting fantasy quarterbacks as we move towards the Colts here. So over the offseason, they lost Gardner Minshew, Zach Moss, Isaiah McKenzie. They added Joe Flacco, though, so everything's going to be fine.
They're fine.
Draft pick-wise in round 2, Adonai Mitchell lasted much further than I thought he would in the actual NFL draft. So AD Mitchell in round 2. Round 5, we've got Anthony Gould, another wide receiver that was added. So let's start with the quarterback. Let's do it. Let's keep this fun train rolling with Anthony Richardson. We talked about him earlier. You mentioned, Shane, hey, if you draft him, maybe pair him with Will Levis just to see. If Anthony Richardson stays healthy for the entirety of the season, what are we looking at with him? Do you have issues taking him at his current ADP, which I pulled up his QB6 as of right now? What do you think with him?
If you could guarantee me health, if you could wave your magic Jake wand and guarantee me Anthony Richard is healthy for, let's say, 15 games.
Got it.
Okay?
Yep.
I think QB1 overall is a possibility because that's how high his rushing floor is.
Wow.
It's just going to depend on two things, his health and his development as a passer. Now, I love Michael Pittman Jr. He's probably one of my most rostered, like, upper echelon wide receivers because he always seems to be a value in drafts. After that, and I know I'm probably skipping ahead, so I apologize, but Adonai Mitchell, Josh Downs, Alec Pierce are the other three guys. And I have no idea how that's going to shake out. And I think their production solely relies on Richardson putting it together as a passer. In college, he never had a season over 60% completion. And that worries the hell out of me. But if Shane Steichen can be the quarterback whisperer that people think he is, I think that Richardson, if healthy, can be really, really freaking good for fantasy.
Yeah, man. We saw it in 3 games last year, and that's all we got to really see it for.
No.
Let me wave my magic Jake wand right now and declare that he will be healthy for at least 14 games. This is not a wand, by the way. This is a measuring tape. Don't ask why that was so close to my computer. That's a personal question.
Well,
But
and Jake, we all know your magic wand is not that big either. So
that's true. I don't need a measuring tape for that. I would be fine with substantially less. I will say when it comes to Anthony Richardson, I'm on board with you, though. QB1 overall upside, I do think, is on the table. Now, I don't love all of the pass catching weapons there. I don't think as much as you do. I like Michael Pittman, but I'm not in love with Michael Pittman. I think he's one of those guys who's better for real life than he is for fantasy. But in real life, he could help Anthony Richardson be better for fantasy. Yeah. So that's a win. Dustin, with Richardson, same deal. I mean, I know health is always a factor, but are you comfortable drafting him at that range? I know you don't take QBs that early, but if you did, would he be on your radar?
Yeah, I agree with Shane here. I think his upside is, top of the class here. And it's really going to be interesting to see, if he takes that step forward. But I'm assuming JT is going to come back healthy this year too. So it's going to be interesting to see the two of them on the field at the same time and how that dynamic works, because JT is a phenomenal running back. And, are they going to run a lot of RPO where they could be, you got to take into account both guys then as runners. Which really raises the floor for Richardson. And then with the pass catchers, Pittman, is on that close to I think he could be considered on the outside of that elite tier. Then the other guys are all quality wide receivers. It's not like they're dogs there, where they can't perform for real NFL. I think they could end up spreading the ball around a lot where, it kind of dilutes for fantasy purposes for the wide receivers. But I think the ceiling is absolutely could be QB1 this year.
I love it. Well, let's talk about Jonathan Taylor. So another guy where health, unfortunately, not staying with him last year, but coming back from the injury. I guess let's talk about it again, assuming I wave the magic Jake wand. Which I tried to get to be my nickname in high school. It never stuck. But let's say I do that and Jonathan Taylor has full health for this year. Is the RB1 overall on the table for him, just like it is for his quarterback? Shane, do you think JT still has that level of upside?
The RB1 overall? No, I don't. And the reasoning for that is the year that he did finish as RB1 overall, he had 18 rushing touchdowns. He also had he only had 2 receiving touchdowns. So because of Richardson, my concern is 1, that he's going to be poached on rushing touchdowns, and 2, because Richardson is a mobile quarterback, he's not going to get enough targets to supplement losing those rushing touchdowns. So I do think he bounces back from last year, but I don't necessarily see him finishing as the RB1 overall. I do see him finishing as top 12 though.
That's an interesting question.
Agree.
And could we see like a Jalen Hurts-esque effect then on the backfield with Anthony Richardson if he's not going to be dumping off, if he's going to be vulturing touchdowns? So Dustin, same question for you. Does he have, let's say, not the overall one upside, but is he able to get close, or are we overvaluing him right now?
I could see maybe top 5 finish if all the things break the right way for him. I mean, the only way he could finish RB1 is if Richardson gets injured again and they have to rely on him and really, feed him the ball. But, we're going to assume full health here. No, I don't see RB1 as his ceiling this season. Top 5, maybe, again, if things break the right way. But where he's being drafted right now, I'll take some other running backs that are going a little bit later than him that I think have probably a little bit higher ceiling than him.
Yeah, I think in best ball I saw he's still around RB5 right now in that general vicinity. I think you guys are swaying me. I don't know. I think you guys are making me more nervous for him. I really do wonder what that lack of touchdown upside does. And let's not pretend like it's a lock for production if Anthony Richardson is sidelined. Remember, I half joked, but they brought in Joe Flacco. He's not exactly Mr. Dump Off. He is Mr. Just fuck it. I'm doing this thing. I'm launching it downfield. So I think either
Michael
way,
Pittman's down there somewhere.
Well, so let's talk about your love for Michael Pittman here. I mean, obviously he's the guy, and you mentioned again we might have some disparity about what the quality is of the guys around him, but are any of those guys, A.D. Mitchell, Josh Downs, Alec Pierce, are any of them worth your time in a draft this year?
I would be willing to take a flyer on Downs or Mitchell. I think Pierce will end up being the odd man out. But Josh Downs last year still had 98 targets. And I don't know if that's been talked about a whole lot, but he was pretty consistent earning targets last year. And I think that will continue this year. I do love Josh Downs, but I'm worried that with the drafting of A.D. Mitchell, it's going to eat into that a little bit more than we expect. So I'm real iffy on both of them just because I think similarly to the other two teams we've already talked about, that they're going to eat into each other and it's going to be the Michael Pittman show for most of the season.
That's fair. Dustin, any of those guys on your radar in redraft?
No, not at all. It's Michael Pittman or bust. Take a flyer on them if I'm doing some best ball drafts, because there's probably going to be weeks where they pop off. But otherwise, no. Just give me Michael Pittman. I don't have any interest in any of these other guys for this year, at least.
Best ball is a good call out. I think I actually would take some random Alec Pierce just on the off chance that Richardson does get hurt, because then it might be Joe Flacco saying, fuck it, Pierce is down there somewhere, because that is kind of his role on the team. So I might convince myself to do that in best ball. But otherwise, yeah, I think it is Michael Pittman or bust. All right. Let's not savor this any longer. Let's get into the best stuff here tonight. Let's talk about your Jacksonville Jaguars. So off-season, fairly eventful, I would say, for them. They lost Calvin Ridley, Jamal Agnew, Zay Jones, which I almost shed a tear over. Love me some Zay Jones. They added Gabe Davis. I almost shed a tear for a different reason over that. They added Mac Jones. They added Devin Duvernay, Josiah DeGuara. Hello, former Packer. In the draft, they also added Brian Thomas Jr. at wide receiver in round 1. In round 5, Keelan Robinson at running back. So let me just, before any specific questions, Shane, how are you feeling about the Jags this year?
Weird. Real weird. There were defensive additions that I felt pretty good about as well. And looking at their weapons on paper, like initially when Brian Thomas Jr. was drafted, I didn't love it because he feels like a Gabe Davis clone. But then looking at it on paper, I was like, I mean, they have really, really good weapons if Thomas hits. With Gabe, like I wouldn't call myself a Gabe Davis truther, but I do think he's probably being undervalued at this point, to where that just room of weapons, including Travis Etienne, Evan Ingram, like they're really, really good on paper. And so I'm very intrigued to see how this offense plays out. And that's honestly the other thing that plays into it. And this is totally not fantasy football related, so I apologize. But the biggest issue that I had with the Jags last year is they lacked an offensive identity. And I'm worried that they still will, because Press Taylor is still the offensive coordinator. And I think ultimately that is going to, Doug Peterson's loyalty to Press Taylor is going to lead to Doug Peterson's downfall. Because there were times where, I should have had this spreadsheet pulled up, but I actually calculated last year, like if they ran the ball a certain amount of times, they won the football game. Like 9 times out of 10. If they didn't run the ball that number of times, they lost the football game pretty frequently. And I can't remember what the threshold was. But it was really frustrating for me because I was like, just lean on the running game a little bit more. And I know that's going to yield to a question later potentially, but it was so frustrating. So I'm hoping that we're either going to lean into the total package of weapons that we have, or we don't, and Doug Peterson realizes, okay, Press Taylor, you can't figure out this offense, and fires him.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time that we've seen a Jags coaching staff member bite the dust early on.
Best kicking coach in the league.
Yep. Yep, there is that. So, one guy we didn't even talk about really in all of this is Christian Kirk. And hopefully he is fully healthy. And obviously we didn't get to see him for the entirety of last season. I don't know if that factors into the identity really at all in your mind or not. But so you mentioned the overlapping traits there potentially with Brian Thomas. But do you think Christian Kirk and Brian Thomas can coexist for fantasy purposes?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Kirk being that typical slot guy that he is, I think is going to continue to get his numbers and get his targets. And what I really think that will do is open up the field for Brian Thomas Jr. and Gabe Davis to both work the field in the ways that they are good at. But I think Kirk is the guy that you definitely want in this offense from a fantasy perspective, probably followed closely by Evan Ingram. But yeah, I mean, Christian Kirk has shown to have that chemistry with T-Law. And I think ultimately he's going to be the guy that we want in this offense for fantasy. And then it'll be like, it might end up being like week to week with BTJ and Gabe Davis on like who's going off this week and who's going off next week. So I think the safe bet is Christian Kirk.
I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Justin, let me ask you this very difficult question. If you have to draft Gabe Davis or Brian Thomas, I guess, would you bother with either? I think I can glean Shane's answer from that. But Dustin, would you be messing with either of them?
If I had to choose one, it'd probably be Brian Thomas. I just don't believe in Gabe Davis right now. Will he have his weeks? Yes, but I've just never been a big believer in him. They drafted Brian Thomas early for a reason, so I'm going to go with the rookie, the guy they spent this draft capital on. If I had to pick a number 2 in this offense. My big question, though, is with these added weapons here, do we expect a jump from T-Law? I know he was, coming out of college, supposed to be this generational quarterback, and we've seen him kind of take steps forward. And we have to forgive his rookie season, obviously, with that dumpster fire that was going on there.
Because of the
but
best
do we see him
coach in the league?
Yeah, exactly. So do we see him continue to take a step forward? And can he? I mean, do you see him working his way into like maybe not the elite tier because he doesn't have that rushing upside, but maybe that second tier of quarterbacks where you're talking maybe like the Joe Burrow level?
Yeah, I'm assuming that question was for me. I think so. I think if he doesn't this year, there's going to be a lot of questions next offseason about what to do with Trevor Lawrence, which coming out of college shocks me, to be honest. I know you're probably sick of me saying on paper, but like if you look at last year's wide receiver group on paper versus this year's wide receiver group on paper, I think this year's, I won't say blows it out of the water, but is significantly better. Where last year let's say your wide receiver 3 is Zay Jones. This year your wide receiver 3 is either Brian Thomas Jr. or Gabe Davis, depending on how that plays out. I personally would take BTJ or Gabe over Zay Jones. The biggest thing for me where T-Law, especially with this wide receiver group, is going to be the chemistry, because last year, like it was apparent that he did not have chemistry with Calvin Ridley. He did have chemistry with Zay Jones, but Zay Jones isn't as talented as any of the guys that were above him or are currently on the roster. And so if he can build that chemistry and continue to step up and make the throws, I absolutely think he can jump into that. It almost sounds like the QB 6-ish to QB 10-ish range is kind of what you're describing, Dustin. I definitely think he can make the jump to that range. He finally got the weapons to do it, I think, too.
Yeah, I like that because he's been one of the guys I've been doing a bunch of best balls lately, and he's been one of the guys I've been targeting late because he's going like something like QB 14 to 16 in best balls right now. And it's just like that seems easy. It just seems like such a value, and I don't know if that's where he's actually going to land come redraft, but if that's the case, like I think he could be a really good late round target for a quarterback that's going to far outproduce his ADP.
Yeah. So Dustin, I'm looking at our league that we're in together, and he finished as QB 8 in 2022 and then QB 13 last year. So if you're buying him at 14 to 16, like that's a smash on value, I think.
I don't know how he's supposed to get there without Zay Jones on the field, frankly, but that's fine. We don't have to talk about that. I'm just a really big Zay Jones believer. But you mentioned the wide receivers getting better on this team. How much does that negatively impact your guy, Evan Ingram, if at all? Or, again, as you mentioned, does he just remain very high on the pecking order?
That's a really good question, Jake.
I try.
I still think he remains fairly like I still see him finishing as probably second or third in targets behind Kirk. Yeah, I would almost be willing to bet he would probably finish second in targets behind Kirk and slightly above either Gabe or Thomas. I really don't know how that duo is gonna play out.
It's gonna be weird.
Yeah, I have no idea how that duo is going to play out. I actually lean a little bit towards Davis because he is a leader in one of my sneaky favorite metrics from Player Profiler. I think it's yards per separation or something like that. But basically, it measures like how much separation you're getting on each target. And other than I think 2022, sorry. He's like in the 2 yards per target range of creating separation. And even that year that he was lower, he was still like a top 12, top 18 option in that specific metric. So he creates separation, and that's what I like from my receivers.
That's what you got to love for your quarterback then too in that situation.
Yeah.
The backfield, let's try to sort this thing out as best as we can. I don't know that it actually takes that much deciphering, but it's fun to think about Tank Bigsby. So we've got Travis Etienne, obviously has been really fantasy useful to say the least over the last couple of seasons. This year, does Tank finally cut in to his workload, or do we see the same type of Travis Etienne workload and fantasy finishes that we're used to?
That is also a good question, and one that I was more prepared for.
Oh, good.
So part of the reason I became a Jags fan is because they drafted Tank Bigsby out of my favorite college football team, and that's Auburn. That was kind of the final nail in the coffin of me picking the Jags and sticking with the team. Because I got made fun of for having 3 favorite teams for a while, but we won't talk about that right now. I made a very, very loose comparison to Tank Bigsby and Kyren Williams a couple months ago, if I remember correctly, where Kyren was drafted, went into a murky backfield, dealt with some injuries, and didn't really produce in year 1. And then year 2 comes flying out of the gate. I don't see Tank Bigsby coming flying out of the gate like that. But I do see Tank And as like from a football perspective and as a Jags fan, hopefully see Tank eat in a little bit more to ETN's workload, because I think kind of to that identity we were talking about earlier, long term, if the Jags want to make progress and make the playoffs and make progress within the playoffs, they've got to keep ETN fresh. And last year, he wasn't fresh by the time they got there because Bigsby didn't step up and they were running Dearness Johnson for whatever flipping reason. I don't understand that. So I really think Tank Bigsby has to step up this year. If it's not him, it's got to be someone, and it could be that 5th round pick, Keelan Robinson. But I am hoping selfishly that it is Tank Bigsby because he is my most rostered player in Dynasty. So I'm hoping for like a 60-40 split between ETN and Bigsby because I think long-term that helps the football team do better. But I also think it could potentially help ETN even be more efficient and also obviously boost Tank's value.
I like it. Dustin, your thoughts on ETN for this year? He's not, I wouldn't say he's like your guy, but I feel like you have an affinity for ETN.
Yeah, I think he's going to finish within the top 10 fairly easily this year. But I do see Tank getting more opportunities than he did last year. To Shane's point, I mean, I agree with basically everything you said. They're going to want him healthy for that playoff run and just keep the legs a little bit fresher. So he can break off those big runs that we saw last year, those explosive plays. So yeah, while Tank's going to be more involved, I still see ETN finishing top 10 probably fairly easily.
Well, let's put this to the test. To close out the show here, let's try to rank the running backs from this division, see if we can get a clear heads or tails. I mean, as we've been going through these guys, I think I know for the most part where you might lend yourself, Shane, but here's the 5 that I would say are in consideration. We can certainly put Tank in there if you just want to have the chance to believe. No, let's do it. All right, let's talk these 6 guys and pick your top 5. Tony Pollard, Tyjae Spears, Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, Joe Mixon, and Jonathan Taylor. What do we think? Who's your favorite out of that? We've kind of said some negative things about all of these running backs, honestly. But Shane, who's at the top of the heap? What do you see the order as?
So I've kind of got it in 2 groups and then a 3rd group with Tank Bigsby at the bottom. But I've kind of got it in 2 groups where there's 2 pretty clear guys for me at the top. And then there's 3 guys below them. And I'm more confused on how to rank those 3 than I am the top 2. I still have JT as number 1. Very, very closely followed by ETN. And then let me go back to the show sheet for a second. I put Pollard at 3, Mixon at 4, and Spears at 5. And that, like, you could convince me to flip Mixon over Pollard. If you left Mixon at 4, I could almost be maybe convinced to flip Spears over Mixon, which seems crazy to say, but those 3 are a lot more confusing to me than the top 2. And to answer your true question, who's my favorite out of these?
Yeah.
It's the Jaguars running backfield. It's Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne. Like, that's another reason that I picked the Jags is I already loved Travis Etienne, and then they went and drafted Tank Bigsby, which, like, from a fantasy perspective, broke my heart because I really wanted Tank to go somewhere he could, like, have more playing time.
Sure.
But from a real football standpoint, I was like, all right, I'm going to go cheer for the Jags now because they've got 2 of my favorite running backs. I love Trevor Lawrence, and this will be a fun team to cheer for.
Yeah, I love that. Braylon Allen really got Tank Bigsby this year, which is unfortunate. Dustin, that's so interesting what you said about the bottom 3, because I'll be curious to see where Dustin tracks here. Do you have a very clear list?
Yeah, and I will say when it comes to the bottom, my bias is definitely going to come through here. But I've got JT, ETN. I want to say Spears 3, Pollard 4, and Mixon 5. And I probably have Mixon too low, but again, that's just my bias against him. I'm not a big Mixon fan, so
I don't
just by
disagree.
default, he's going to be at the bottom of my rankings pretty much every time. So there's my top 5, Jake.
I like it. And Shane, again, you said you were very flexible with those 3, and I think that our definitive list speaks to that because I do have ETN just ahead of Jonathan Taylor, and that was even before you guys had me a little more worried about Jonathan Taylor. So now I'm more confident in that. And then I have Spears at number 3, just a slight preference over Pollard in that backfield. I do have Mixon at number 4, and then Pollard right behind him at number 5. But yeah, this is a weird division for running backs this year, and I don't know that I love it, frankly.
I didn't want to look like a total homer and put ETN first.
I don't hate that though.
There,
I mean,
man.
it's very close for me as well. You know, I don't hate putting ETN over JT. I think it's going to be closer than people think come the end of the season.
Yeah, I agree.
I love JT, but I got to do it. Well, Shane, anything else that you want to impart from your beloved Jaguars? Anything else you want to talk about?
Jake, I don't know how many of your listeners play IDP, but Josh Allen, obviously, Trayvon Walker is going to be good. And then I'd even be fine taking Eric Armstead. Their defensive line's going to be nasty, and I'm really excited. I'm excited about that. I comment probably too often on our local radio show because they stream at the same time. And I called them Saxonville. And one of the hosts took exception to that. And I was like, hold up now. We made some moves this offseason to really bolster the pass rush. So I'd love to see a imagination of Saxonville.
I mean, it's a stellar nickname. I'm rooting for them just so that you get to use the nickname in earnest more this year. So I'm with you. All right. Well, Dustin, anything else that you have? I think otherwise that will do it for us tonight.
No, other than the normal closeout here of following all of us on Twitter/X. Give our guest Shane a follow. He's a great follow. Follow my partner here, Jake. He is great as well. You can follow me if you want. I'm mediocre at best. But definitely follow our podcast handle at Drinking Fantasy. Subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe to YouTube. Click on the little bell to let you know when we go live, so you can see our beautiful faces. And we have guests like Shane on. You can join us in the chat, which is always really fun. So do all that good stuff and follow us.
Absolutely. Shane, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You've been an absolute delight. And I'll just say it, Duval. Did I do it right? Did I say
Duval?
Okay, I didn't do enough use. That's on me. Next time I'll have more use into the mix. But thank you for joining us sincerely. Yes, go follow at FFShaneB on socials. And until next time, keep drinking and talking fantasy football.
Cheers, FFers.
Not yet.